Welcome to the Economy Magazine. I'm Binyamin. Tjong-Alvares with a look at the world economy. Coming up, as Singapore mourns its founder, uncertainty looms, and new world beers take on the old world. First, the headlines. Brent crude oil shot up nearly 6% on Thursday after Saudi Arabia and its Gulf Arab allies began a military operation in Yemen. Oil prices jumped as traders worried the Saudi attack was a sign that fighting in the oil-rich Middle East was out of control and spreading. Brent futures rose more than $3 a barrel to as high as $59.78 a barrel just before 0800 GMT. But while output remained strong from U.S. shale oil and Russia, there's little immediate worry about any shortages developing. Stock markets globally were lower on Thursday amid jitters about the pace of the U.S. economic recovery and the escalating conflict in Yemen. European shares fell for a second straight session on Thursday, while stocks in Japan suffered their steepest sell-off since mid-January. U.S. stocks reacted negatively to a weaker-than-expected report on durable goods orders, pushing the Dow Jones Industrial Average into negative territory. Investors remain focused on the U.S. economy to gauge the timing of an expected interest rate hike, likely to sap money from riskier assets. Schlumberger, the world's largest oil services group, pleaded guilty to violating U.S. sanctions and facilitating trade with Iran and Sudan. The oil giant will be on corporate probation for 3 years and pay a $233 million penalty. The U.S. Justice Department said Schlumberger provided oil field services and technical expertise to customers in Iran and Sudan through non-U.S. subsidiaries. The settlement is the last in a series of deals reached with U.S.-based companies found to have breached sanctions. The world's biggest pharmaceuticals companies have formed a partnership with Genomics England to use genetic data in medical research. GlaxoSmithKline AstraZeneca will team up with Roche, AbbVie, and Biogen to decode the genomes of 100,000 NHS patients with cancer and rare diseases. So far, about 3,000 genomes have been sequenced, with a target to create the world's largest database of the DNA code in human cells. The 10-strong consortium of pharma companies adds industry expertise to the government project, using the genetic data to create more personalized medicines. The death of Singapore founder Lee Kuan Yew marks the end of an era at a time when the country faces slowing economic growth. But despite the current difficulties, businesses believe Mr. Lee's policies and philosophy will outlast the elder statesman.
From a third world country, today we're in the first world country.
Singapore became a city-state of mourning, and world leaders from the U.S. to China sent tributes early this week in the wake of the death of Singapore's first Prime Minister, Lee Kuan Yew. He was known for his iron fist and decried by proponents of human rights for the lack of democratic freedoms in his system. That authoritarianism was mixed with unregulated, even libertarian capitalism. Lee was polarizing, to say the least, but the outpouring of public emotion for the 91-year-old has been widespread.
I think his greatest legacy is what we see in Singapore today. We see all the structures that have come up here. We look at the housing policy. More than 80% of the people live in public housing, flats built by the government.
Lee is seen as the catalyst for the transformation of a small territory with few natural resources into a central player in finance, high-tech, and shipping. Singapore also enjoys one of the world's highest per capita incomes, according to the AFP report. Lee's vision influenced China's path, particularly as it liberalized in the 1980s. Some analysts suggest that a move away from Lee's brand of political authoritarianism, including driving opponents to self-exile or financial ruin through lawsuits, could be in store for the country of 5.5 million. But either way, Singapore will move forward.
I am convinced, that we have enough people, whether within the establishment or outside the establishment, to take this place, to take this country to newer heights. So I don't have this feeling that Singapore needs Lee Kuan Yew.
Lee's son, Lee Hsien Loong, is the current Prime Minister, serving since 2004.
I'm very happy to be here in Washington.
Singapore has always been able to change and adapt in order to remain competitive. Still, the passing of statesman Lee Kuan Yew falls at a time that is particularly challenging, both domestically as well as internationally. We're joined in the studio by analyst Sam Chester from investment management firm Clarity Capital for a look at what might lie ahead for the island city-state. Mr. Chester, thanks for joining us.
It's a pleasure. Good to be here.
So what does lie ahead? What's going on with Singapore these days?
Well, I think that with the passing, the moving on of the first statesman, the prime minister for over 3 decades of Singapore, it's a good time to look at his legacy and to consider how his legacy will impact the country. There's a great quote. One of the things you can certainly say for the late Prime Minister Lee was that he was a man who very much spoke his mind. And a number of years ago, he famously said, even if I'm being lowered into the ground and if I see things are not going right here, I will get back up. That said, I think most people, when they look at his legacy, as the video said, they tend to look at modern day Singapore and they look at the very low corruption in the government. They look at the social order. They look at the rule of law. I would agree with that. I think it's interesting, perhaps, we can discuss 3 issues in particular. One, looking at the economy, which famously took the country from a third world economy to first world. 2, looking at the diplomatic angle, which when Singapore was established in the late 1960s, every country around it was a rival. And today, you see how Singapore is very close with both the US and China and all of its neighbors. And the third is to look at the democratic legacy, which, of course, Singapore was the model for much of East Asia, including China, with the sort of democratic authoritarianism, which China could say is edging towards. So those are 3 things I think it's interesting to consider. Briefly, I would say that on the economic angle, Singapore today is dealing with a transition to try to raise productivity. Its productivity is actually fairly low since its economic success has been based upon investment from abroad and from workers coming from abroad. So they have economic challenges which Lee's successors will, including his son, the current prime minister, will have to work with. On the diplomatic angle, I think what's very interesting is that to see how can the successors to Lee, who don't have his sort of personal charisma and personal relationships in both Beijing and in Washington, how can they maintain that difficult balancing act between the two major powers in the region? And thirdly, on the democratic angle, as was also mentioned, that's going to be the biggest challenge of all. Professor Francis Fukuyama, the American expert, has said that Lee was a good emperor. Well, as we know from history, it's very difficult to find many good emperors in any system. A country that is blessed with having one good emperor is not always so fortunate to find others as well.
Right. And where does this leave Singapore? I mean, considering that we're having this shift to a completely different leader, really. I mean, he's essentially already been on the stage to some extent. But as you mentioned yourself, there are serious challenges facing Singapore. Where do we see this going from here on?
Well, there's no question that from the country that Lee not just inherited but helped develop in the 1960s to what we see today, it's an entirely different position. The successors, Singapore today is not only a first world country, but it's a first world country that is the center in many ways, the corporate business center for the most thriving economic region in the world of East Asia. So I think that as long as you're going to see the East Asian economies continue and develop, and as long as Singapore maintains a primary role in that, then you're going to see its economic success continue, and the social order will probably continue as well.
It's been interesting, actually, also to mention the fact that Singapore is this city-state, so to speak, that has established itself, even though it didn't have any natural resources, not unlike a country like Israel, which, of course, today has natural resources. But what is the special relationship there?
So it's actually fascinating, and you use the correct word saying special relationship, because that's what both leaders in Singapore and in Israel have pointed to. For many years, it was kept under the radar. There were media reports about the thriving military relationship between the two countries, which, as you correctly pointed out, have a lot of natural similarities. There's sort of isolation from their neighbors at one point, particularly early on. It wasn't actually until Lee's autobiography in 2000, when he wrote a book that acknowledged for the first time that not only had the Israeli military helped the Singapore armed forces, but they had essentially designed the army from the ground up completely. There's a famous anecdote in his book that recalls that in the first few years of Singapore's independence, they used to actually march in the military parade to Israeli songs in Hebrew. So the two countries have had a thriving relationship, like many places where Israel's developed external relations based on the military. What's very important today for that is that as Israel's looking more and more to develop economic relations in East Asia and even in Southeast Asia, what Singapore provides them with is a platform. It provides them with a gateway into this thriving region. I think for many countries and corporations around the world, when they look to engage the region, they say perhaps Shanghai, perhaps Hong Kong, and perhaps Singapore.
Right.
I think what Israeli business and political interests realize is that from an Israeli perspective, Singapore has an additional advantage due to that history, which Prime Minister Lee was the one who helped develop it and make it happen.
Obviously can serve as a springboard for Israel as well. Thank you very much, Sam Chester from Clarity Capital, for joining us in the show. Thank you.
It's a pleasure as always.
Thank you. America's craft beer industry has been making huge inroads in the domestic market for years. But now, when world producers are looking to take the old world by storm, with increasing numbers exporting their goods.
America's beer industry is undergoing something of a renaissance. Gone are the days you could only find the likes of Bud, Miller or Coors. Today, the $100 billion a year market is awash with craft beers. But with so many looking to cash in on the sector, 3,200 breweries and growing fast, the market is becoming a crowded place.
We looked across the U.S. and thinking about where we wanted to expand to, we started seeing a lot of competition popping up. And so we started looking further afield, so we started looking outside the U.S.
In April, the Bronx Brewery will start exporting its pale ales to the UK, a market that could be considered challenging given its maturity and the already diverse selection available. However, US brewers bring some unique elements to the table.
All of our beers use West Coast American hops, which are drastically different than most of the hops that brewers in the UK are using. So a lot more fruity, tropical notes, a lot of piney notes in some of the hops. So I think from our beer standpoint, a lot of the malt flavors will be familiar, but the hops will be unique and different. So excited to see how the beers are received.
As with wine, the US took its lead on beer from Europe for a long time. However, in recent years, they have really shaken up the industry and are now teaching old world brewers a thing or two.
So what's really incredible about American craft beer is there's no precedent. So our imagination is limitless, and we can put anything into beer, absolutely anything. So we're putting things like chocolate and bacon and barrel aging and blending and putting anything you can think of in beer. There's really no rules, which has sort of been our gift to the brewing world.
Craft beer exports from the US grew 49% in 2013. It still only accounts for 2% of US production, but that figure is set to continue rising as countries all over the world show a growing taste for American craft beer.
Some of its proximity, the number one country being exported to by craft brewers is Canada. Then behind that is Sweden. I would attribute that to strong interest in that country. Then you've got the UK, Australia, and then Japan. One of the fastest emerging markets actually is Asia, very encouraging, with Singapore, Thailand.
Craft beer is the wild frontier of the US brewing industry. The rulebook has been thrown out the window, with new innovations and flavours appearing all the time. And not content with changing just Americans' attitudes, these brewers are now looking to take on beer drinkers around the world.
And now for our offbeat section with i24 News journalist Daniel Roth in Media Watch. So Daniel,
how's it going?
From beer to
sewage. It's not a joke. We're really talking about sewage today. The reason is that it turns out there's an enormous amount of precious metals in our waste.
Precious metals?
Yes.
How did they get there?
So they get there, first of all, because all kinds of products, medicines, shampoos, foods even, are using micro bits is the best way I can describe it. Tiny, tiny bits, for example, soaps to make sure that body odor doesn't come back. Of course, these end up in the sewage. And according to one report from Arizona State University, a study found $13 million of precious metals can be found each year in sewage in the U.S. 13 million. So Tokyo has already started doing this, and they've reported that they've been doing as well as some of the best gold mines in the world.
They have to sift through the sewage to get there, though, don't they?
Right. Yes, they do. Now, this has a side effect, which is that if countries, instead of burning and releasing sewage, as they tend to do, are leaving it for gold miners to sift through, it may actually lead to better systems for dealing with sewage. So not only will we save the world by not mining so much, but we may also
All right.
keep it cleaner.
Let's leave this behind. Something else. A little
Yes, a
more
not related story from McDonald's. Apparently, McDonald's is selling Big Mac clothing for people, for dogs also. Big Mac marked blankets and things like this. This is a real thing.
Oh my gosh.
Sweden is the place where they kicked this off.
What does it say for the Swedes, right?
It's a big question what it says about the Swedes. Here's the thing, though. A pair of pajamas cost 500 shekel. That's like $125. Something like this. It's
for a Big Mac pajama.
Yes, it's an enormous amount of money.
Okay, well, I think that we've said it all. Thank you very much,
Yes.
Daniel Roth, for joining us about Big Mac pajamas and sewage. And that is the end of our show. I'm Binyamin Tjong-Alvares. Thanks for watching The Economy Show. Join us again next week for more on The Economy.